All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise Above Justice Movement podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the founder and the host of the Rise Above Justice Movement and the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. Today, I'll give a viewer discretion is advised due to the nature of the topics that we will be discussing. All right. So, it's been a while. This is going to be one of the funnest interviews that I've probably ever done. I'm deeply excited to welcome, California State Senator Sasha. Welcome to the podcast. I am a big fan of the work that you do, and I would love for you to just dive in and introduce yourself to our audience. We've collaborated on some collaborative posts on social media, but I would love for you to just dive right in and just share who you are and what led you into be getting into politics.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one, thank you for having me. It's really just an honor to be on, and also, just appreciate all the partnership that we've had, and just uplifting, I think, a lot of the policies that we've introduced, which is something that's so important to me. Social media messaging, right, I think is so critical right now to be able to reach different audiences and make sure that we're getting information out there about the work that we're leading. I'm Senator Sasha Renee Perez. I represent the 25th Senate District, which is an area that I have lived in for my entire life. And three generations of my family are from here in this West San Gabriel Valley, which is what we refer to as this region. I came into this work really as an organizer and working in policy, and spent 15 years of my life working in education policy. I used to run an after school program at Roosevelt High School in Boyle Heights and really fell in love with that work. I decided to run for my local city council, my hometown of the city of Alhambra, back in 2019 in the late fall. And it was a decision that completely changed my life. I ran against the incumbent mayor at the time and was very, very happy to win that election by a landslide. It was a huge victory, and we ran a very grassroots campaign. And really, that led me here now to being a senator. So it's definitely been a labor of love. I am very proud to be a grassroots candidate, and to continue to bring that into so much of the legislative work that I do today.
And looking over, well, first of all, before I even get into like some of your, because I want to talk about your Senate campaign and what you ran on, and kind of like piece together like what you're doing now. And for anybody out there who is listening, Sasha is a badass. I'm just gonna be the first to say it. I am the biggest fan. I am gushing. I am beyond excited. I know you can tell it, but it is truly an honor because it's not very often that we have these super progressive voices that are fighting for the people over a corporation, over big money, on your platform. And you ran on the platform of solving homelessness and public safety and protecting access to reproductive health care and education, climate action, housing, jobs, an economy that works for all. And California is really a hub of a lot of different things, right? It's not just about Disneyland. It's not just about, but there's a lot more rich history that comes in with that, right? And thinking about, Dolores Huerta right now and her coming forward with her story, you know, as a survivor myself, it strikes a chord, right? And it kind of pieces together a lot of that history that nobody had any idea. You had like that suspicion, but you don't have that idea. You know what I mean? So I would love for you to just kind of talk about what you're doing now, what you've done since becoming a senator in 2024, taking office in 2025. So the last year, what have you like really what have you been proud of? What's some of your proudest accomplishments? And walk us through like just bits of that.
Yeah, well, it has definitely been a very intense, year and 4 months, right, since I've been in office. I was sworn in December of 2024, but I began my time up in Sacramento, in the legislature on January 6th of 2025. And the very next day on January 7th, we had the fires occur. And so the Eaton fires hit Altadena. It was the largest fire catastrophe and most significant fire catastrophe that the state has ever seen. And it was my first time dealing with a fire like this at this level. I'd never experienced anything like this before. And frankly, the San Gabriel Valley had never experienced anything like that before. And so for me, it was a really eye-opening moment because I needed to learn so much about the disaster recovery process. And so my time in the legislature, I think, is frankly going to be very much shaped by how I started, which is really assisting people with navigating government during their most difficult and challenging moments. And I think that experience really opened up for me a real bird's eye view into how corporations really try to take advantage of people at some of their lowest moments. I've, seen firsthand how the insurance industry will play games with folks that are, disaster survivors. I saw firsthand how, landlords and slumlords, within LA's housing market, were price gouging following the fires because they knew that people were desperate for housing and trying to work their way around the state's anti-price gouging laws in order to take advantage of folks that were so desperately trying to find a place to stay. And it's frankly really disgusting and infuriating. And I have really, I think, learned so much just from everything that happened over the past year. And I think it's driven a lot of the legislation that you've seen us introduce around really going after a lot of these corporations and a lot of these companies, whether it's investor-owned utilities, um, insurance, whatever it may be, to try to really call out the bad actors that have tried to take advantage of the situation.
I'm physically based in the state of Kansas. I grew up in Missouri, and hearing about the fires that took place, it was deeply devastating. Seeing some of my friends being impacted by it, I have friends like all across the country, and a lot of them live in California and they're from, your area, but also like just all over. And just hearing about it and watching the response, but also seeing people come together to help out their neighbors, I think that was something that was very eye-opening. It's like, okay, there is still a lot of love in the world, right? To take care of other people. But you're right. There was also a lot of tragedy outside of those fires because the price gouging and profiting off of a tragedy is predatory, to say the least, right? For the lack of a better term, but it really is. It's very predatory. Now, thinking about, and the community is still recovering from these fires. This is not just a one and done thing. This is something that is going to take quite a while to get back. And, also the mental health aspect to that. And, what are you trying to think of the best way to phrase this? What are you seeing now in like that recovery phase? What are people needing that you think needs obviously a lot more amplification? People need to be talking about, or people need to be helping with. What are you seeing as far as like that recovery phase goes from those fires?
Well, I think a couple of things, right? I mean, I think it's really uncovered for me that we need stronger regulations around our insurance industry, right? And this doesn't just go for California. This is an issue
Mhm.
that I think affects every state in the country.
Mhm.
Ensuring that insurers are providing their customers and providing them with their claims and the money that they're owed in a timely manner, that they are not unfairly delaying and denying those claims, because we know that that's a game that they often play, and not just within the insurance industry and the housing market, but also even in the medical insurance industry. It's a lot of the same games. In addition to that, too, we need to have stronger regulations around corporations purchasing land and property, particularly in these areas that have been hit very hard by a disaster. Altadena is a historic Black community. It has a very large number of Black and Latino residents, and there has been a real targeting of some of those homeowners who lost all of their generational wealth, to make low ball offers to them by, these huge companies. Lots of times they're based overseas. Many of them are based here. And there's been study after study done to show that a large portion of the homes that have been purchased by corporations. We know that this isn't just happening in disaster areas. We've seen large corporations buying up housing stock across the country as investments and profits and turning that into rental property. That ultimately has an impact on the housing stock that's available to all of us and impacts our housing markets. And so we have a bill in that space as well. And so, I look at what's happened in the fires, and it's really given me, I think, a larger perspective to many of the other issues that are impacting not just the rest of California, but the rest of the United States.
Mhm. Exactly. And I know you introduced the legislation, SB 1076, to ensure homeowners who make their homes fire safe can obtain and keep home insurance. You think this would be like an automatic, like, no brainer, right? But obviously, even like California, there's still a lot of work to do. Whenever we
Absolutely.
look at California and we look at some of the other, blue states, and there's still so much work to do. I lived in Minnesota, and I was astonished at what I was learning because, Minnesota's always been like a model state, right? A lot of other states have adopted a lot of their, policies, and a lot of that, there is still some like very heavy lacking key pieces of legislation to help ensure like accountability. One of the other things I wanted to really touch on, my hometown of Independence, Missouri, is currently working on building a multi-million square foot data center.
Oh my goodness.
I have been watching it, and the judge just recently, as of either yesterday or the day before yesterday, would not allow the people to vote on it. The city council shut people out of the conversation, despite people showing up in like record numbers. My town, it's fairly good size. A little over 100,000 people potentially. Possibly a little bit more. You always have like those stragglers just kind of like come in at random times, but 100,000 people, but you have this entire like city hall that's filled with people that are in opposition and maybe like one or two that are for it, but they didn't really like take any anything that they were saying serious. Like they had some very like serious health concerns. What about the water? What about this? What about that? Look what's happening in like I think it's Memphis, Tennessee, with like one of Elon's those emissions just going into that and
Yeah,
fueling making people literally sick. So
absolutely.
I wanted to thank you for, obviously sharing that. And I know that it passed that first committee vote. Um, what about like those data centers, and the community accountability, or I guess the lack of accountability that's currently going on with it, which is why we need that accountability. But what are you kind of seeing around like these data centers? Because they're rapidly expanding across the country, and it's the electricity bills are skyrocketing. And, I'm thinking of like those single parents that have to work two, three, four jobs just to provide food for their family because the cost of living is too damn high. I'm thinking about ones specifically like that, the poor and the working class. What are these data centers doing in those communities that you are also seeing?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's been examples all over the United States. I can think about, West Virginia, who, when they had a data center pull out of their state, it actually caused the entire electrical system to collapse. They had massive blackouts all over the state. In New Mexico, you had, extreme environmental damage to the surrounding area nearby a data center that was built. There's a lack of guardrails that exist for this type of infrastructure infrastructure. Now, data centers have existed for over a decade, right? We utilize them for, all of the kind of like internet behavior that we have now, but the massive escalation that we've seen in the expansion of these data centers is really the result of AI and AI technologies, right? And that's what's really driven the rapid growth that we've seen. And the amount of water that they use, the amount of energy that they use is being called into question. People have real concerns. And what we've seen is that these data centers oftentimes are not carrying their full electrical load. They're putting out the cost of that electricity onto surrounding homeowners, surrounding renters, rather than them paying for that cost themselves. They oftentimes are not doing environmental reviews before they're instituting in the building of these new data centers. And in addition to that, they are often utilizing a whole lot of fresh water. And so, as we're having these discussions in our communities, people are showing up in mass. I currently have the biggest data center in Los Angeles County being proposed in a city in my district, the city of Monterey Park, and something like 350 people showed up to this meeting to oppose it. And as a result of that, organizers have fought successfully to put a ban on data centers onto the upcoming June ballot, which I am supporting. And, these are grassroots organizers that brought this together. And, I think that they're saying something very simple, which is we cannot consider this type of infrastructure and continue to have these proposals until we have more guardrails in place and we can figure out the overall environmental and economic impact. And frankly, we've seen a lot of bipartisan support around issues like this, right? This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. Folks across the board are coming out in mass to oppose these things because there is this sense that I've heard from my constituents that people are fed up with seeing the system be gamed, where corporations profit and they put their cost onto the backs of consumers. And we are the ones who continually have to pick up the bill. And it should not be that way. And that is ultimately what I'm trying to get to. This is why I introduced legislation around this to force data centers to have to carry the full cost of the electricity that they are going to need to utilize. And I can tell you that a number of data center companies have opposed my bill. It is a very straightforward bill that addresses this cost issue, but it's because they don't want to carry this cost. Why should we have to bear the burden? And I think that it points to this larger issue that not just Californians, but Americans in general are beginning to point out. Corporations trying to get away with paying their fair share, and we need to bring a stop to it.
You need to run for Congress. I've been thinking that ever since like we started talking. I'm like, you need to run for Congress. Um, I want to shift a moment, and it's something that is very near and dear, not only to the work that I do, but right now we're seeing ICE surges across the country. ICE is showing up at airports, to quote unquote support TSA agents. In reality, I'm very active on social media and see, we have like 300 and something thousand followers. So I see a lot of different things, right? And our algorithm is really wonky. One minute I'll see ice, the next minute I'll see a puppy. Don't get me wrong, I love seeing puppies, but I have my own pain in the ass that there comes a time that I want to shift and look at something else. He's a poodle, right? So he's very hyper, kind of like me. I wonder where he gets it from. But you introduced SB 995, and this is the Masuma Khan Justice Act, authored by yourself, and then you have a couple like co-authors. Um, hearing, sorry, I get emotional on this because I think about Liam from Minnesota, the 5-year-old. I cannot get that image out of my head.
Yeah.
I cannot get that image out of my head. And one of my collaborators also knows about Masuma, and I know this is a very deep and horrific story. Um, what led you to creating? I know this. I know the answer to this, but what led you to author this legislation? Sorry, this is deeply emotional to me, but what led you to authoring this legislation? And I want to dive into this a little bit because this isn't the first, accountability act that you've authored around, ICE and such. But specifically, let's talk about Masuma for a second.
Yeah, and I understand why the situation brings up so many emotions for you because it does for me as well. I mean, I think for so many people, we see what's happening in detention centers. We see photos and videos of a child like Liam, and we just know that this is wrong in so many ways. And in the most simplest of terms, that this is absolutely wrong and inhumane. In Masuma's case in particular, we became introduced to her because of her daughter Ria, and her daughter Ria is really such an incredible woman. And she had reached out to our office to inform us that her mom had been taken from her immigration check-in appointment in downtown Los Angeles. She showed up as she was supposed to. She was doing everything right, and did not give her any time to warn her family, did not allow her to have any phone calls, and just immediately took her. And her family was obviously alarmed when they finally got the call from California City that she was being detained there. Um, what occurred over that next month of time while she was held is just, in my opinion, human rights abuses. Being denied access to medical care, being denied access to medicine. They were refusing her right to an attorney, providing her dirty water to drink, and giving her food that looked like it was spoiled. When she informed them that she was very cold because it is incredibly cold in many of these detention centers, and she requested an additional blanket. She was denied. When she asked if she could have a jacket, they told her she would have to purchase it at the commissary. When she requested to purchase one, they told her that they no longer had any. And then when she took off her socks to place around her neck to keep her warm, they told her that if she did that, that she would be in trouble for doing that and would be fined for trying to keep herself warm. And so when she was released, we met here in my office. And I mean, the situation just really shook me. You have to understand, like, this is somebody that survived the fires and the Eaton fires. And, to have her sit there in front of me and tell me that even after being released, she was dealing with the trauma. And we have an annual Christmas tree lighting event in Altadena where 5,000 people participate every year. Thousands come out. And she didn't participate for the first time after over 20 years of living in Altadena because she was so terrified that ICE would grab her again. It really, really broke me. I mean, I was just so infuriated just hearing her story. And she asked me a very simple question. And she said, if you're a senator for the state of California, I don't understand why you couldn't come get me. And that really hit home for me because I looked at her and I said, you're absolutely right. How could I be a representative for this state and this facility is operating in my state and I don't have the authority to walk in there? There's something very wrong with that. And
Mhm.
so I contacted my team after, and I let my chief of staff know that this was my number one priority, was to do something about this. And so we worked on crafting that bill, just me and him sitting in the office for hours, figuring it out. We worked with MalDef and a team of attorneys, but you know, it's caused these situations, these issues have caused, I think, so many of us that work in government to ask ourselves these questions, to say, like, things are not functioning right. And how do we write policies to try to correct a system that is failing people? Because that is what is happening. When I hear stories that somebody has died in detention, that is a failure of the system. It is inhumanity happening in real time. And it is our job to do something about it. And we can't just continue to cast things aside and say it's the federal government and they're the ones that regulate that. No. Why would we allow these things to happen in the state of California? We know we're better than that. My constituents want better than that. And so, for me, I this is just so personal. I can't emphasize that enough. I tell people I feel like Masuma is a member of my family. She reminds me of so many of my family members. And though culturally we might have different cultural backgrounds, there's so much similarities there. And I just feel just very, very, very driven to get this bill in particular passed. So,
What's it looking like? What are you hearing the conversation around this? What's the current state in which getting it passed? What's kind of happening with it right now?
it's honestly, the conversations have been very positive. And I I think that we have drafted a very strong piece of legislation,
Mhm.
because that is our intention with trying to write something like this. This is not just simply about immigration detention centers. We crafted the bill more broadly. We said
Mhm.
any private detention center operating here in California, because we know that Core Civic and these other companies like GEO Group, that they own multiple facilities across the country as well as in the state that are not just immigration detention centers. And how we're approaching this is to say that these places need to be regulated in the same way that other commercial facilities need to be regulated in the state. So I think we're in a great position. I've talked with many folks about this, and I think Masuma's story is incredibly powerful. It is such a perfect example of a complete failure by the system and a complete lack of oversight and accountability.
You said the key thing, and it's the lack of accountability. And I want to point to, I mentioned that I live in the state of Kansas. And in Leavenworth, Kansas, which there is a federal prison that is in that area, Core Civic, which owns a lot of these facilities, and it's a for-profit. They make this money off of people being detained and being kidnapped off the streets. Like, they literally profit. There's an article from ACLU of Kansas, and I'm going to jump in and talk about. I'm going to go back to California. Give me just one moment. Um, but it kind of relates into what you just stated. They're a for-profit prison corporation, and they have a very long track record of running facilities rife with dangerous conditions across the country. So much that the company actually rebranded in 2016 to separate itself from its previous identity, which was Corrections Corporation of America. They're known for mismanagement. They're known for forced labor, inhumane living conditions, excessive use of force, prolonged use of solitary confinement, medical negligence, physical and sexual abuse, spying and voyeurism, overcrowding, understaffing, and other civil rights violations. The facility that they just opened the quote unquote ICE detention center is the same facility that they had to close due to these allegations in the state. It was closed, and now the Leavenworth City Council approved it 5-1. There's only 6 city council members, but approved it five to one despite community pushback. And it's like the lack of accountability in this, and their money talks. Their money
Absolutely.
got into the pockets of those city council members. We already know that. And obviously, ACLU is extremely, obviously, very pissed off about what's happening. And ACLU is already filing suits and such. And obviously, Kansas has a lot of other issues going on right now, too. But I want to jump in and talk about publiccouncil.org did a write up, and it is titled Messages and Chilling Accounts from Inside Immigration Detention Facilities Show Urgent Need for Legislation to Strengthen State Oversight. Obviously it goes in, it talks about, the bill that you're introducing, Senate Bill 995, would strengthen state oversight of private detention facilities. Again, as we stated earlier, you would think this would already be like a no brainer. Under the legislation, California would exercise its state authority to impose fines up to $25,000, which obviously these corporations can obviously afford, per violation per day, and suspend or revoke state issued permits to operate if facilities fail to meet health, safety, and labor standards in the same manner the state conducts inspections of other involuntary residential facilities. It seems like a no brainer. Like you said, it doesn't just specifically state about ICE, it just states as a blanket statement because it's common sense.
That's right.
And it also kind of goes in and talks about the report that was released last year. The California Attorney General reviewed 6 private immigration detention facilities in California and found serious deficiencies, including inadequate medical and mental health care, inadequate suicide prevention protocols, a lack of transparency regarding use of force practices, and impacts to due process rights as guaranteed by the United States Constitution. Speaking of which, obviously what we're seeing right now is not due process. It's not. Every person on American soil or, occupied soil has a right to due process. Literally as guaranteed by the US Constitution. It's literally common sense. I believe it's the Fifth and 14th Amendment, or Fourth and 15th Amendment, is along those lines. It's something like that. Um, at present, California has approximately 7,000 detention beds across all facilities, and it's all a part of the same system, that for-profit prison system, this prison industrial complex that's for profit and profiting off of physical labor and sexual abuse. It's deeply alarming. You know this as well as I do, and you see it on a daily basis in your role as state senator. You have constituents that are contacting you like, what can we do about this? And it's like your hands are kind of tied at the moment, which is why this bill absolutely needs to pass. And how we can amplify it, let us know, because we want to start getting some momentum around this, because it's a crucial piece of legislation that you and your chief of staff have created. Um, we've talked about a lot in this, but how are you feeling, in this current moment, just about the state of the country, the state of the world, which is quite literally on fire in a lot of different ways? I know we were talking about fires earlier, so sorry, bad pun. No pun intended. I like to bring a little bit of comedy into this, because obviously talking about these topics on a daily basis, it can be very like draining, right? So
Yeah.
what are you doing in this present moment that just kind of gives you that hope and just gives you that sense of, okay, we need to keep going. We need to keep going. You're a game changer. You won by 19 points in 2024. You are a kick-ass senator. I wish I had you in the state of Kansas. I would love to have you here. I might move to California, move to your district, so I feel like I can actually have that person that just listens and just pays attention. And watching your comments on social media, obviously you have those stragglers that come along, or like, oh yeah, you're not doing shit, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. But majority of people that follow you, they're very uplifting and they love the work that you're doing, encouraging you to continue doing that more. So what gives you that hope in this present time and in this current moment to keep going? What, and I know it's stories like Matsuma, it's stories like Liam, it's stories, like your own personal story, but also just survivors and, the fire survivors and just what gives you that hope to keep going?
I see hope every day, you know? I
Mhm,
see hope every day in people. I'm always just so moved by, the organizers and the people who get up and are fighting for their communities. I look at Masuma as a perfect example. Despite everything that she has been through, that she wants to come forward and share her story so bravely. And she wants justice for the other people that were there in that detention center. She's introduced me to those that have been released, and they don't feel comfortable with coming forward publicly with their stories, but she wants me to see them and get to meet them. And she wants them to know that something is being done about what they experienced. And I see that kind of hope in so many that we can have better than what exists right now. And I just really try to relish in the wins that we do get.
mhm,
Seeing her be released and so many other of my community members be released from detention. Watching my community members fight back against the insurance industry and win. We have an investigation into State Farm. We secured that investigation because thousands of people individually reached out to the Department of Insurance to share their stories. And there's so much more work that's still happening, right? And I see it at the federal level as well. I mean, we have watched the Trump administration roll back on everything from, their lawsuit against DEI programs that they
mhm,
dropped just a couple of months ago.
mhm,
And it was a result of us taking that battle to court, and they realized that they could not win. Now, there was damage done in the process, but we fought and we won. And I continue to have to just remind folks of that we're winning. And that's not a sexy narrative that you'll see on the news because it's not
mhm,
the doom and gloom that they want to
mhm.
portray. But I see hope in so many people every single day. And they really inspire me to get up and do the work. Like, how could I not, you know?
And it's one of those things like if you don't do it, who's going to? Who's going to listen? Who's going to pay attention? And who's going to take into account what your constituents want versus a corporation or versus, dark money? And, because to be frank, we have a lot of money in politics and there's a lot of negative influence in that. And you focus a lot on affordability. And I know, like, in a lot of your previous experiences, um, kind of like reading like your biography, like you worked at the campaign for college opportunity, right?
Mhm.
You focused a lot on, like improving college access and success and affordability for California students. And I want to tie in some more of like, things that have been cut by this administration. Obviously attacking the Department of Education, like you said, eliminating, DEI, a lot of the DEI programs and, pushing these voucher scams. And that's what I call them because that's correctly what they are. But, instead of funding the public education, here in Kansas, they keep yanking funding out of special education, and attacking, Section 504. And unfortunately, my state attorney general is a part of that lawsuit, of removing certain sections of Section 504, which, a lot of IEP access. And it comes from an anti-trans standpoint, is where he brings his, his argument from, like, oh, we can't affirm trans students. We can't do this, we can't do that. And then, obviously, Kansas is also the first state to take away driver's licenses for trans individuals. I know you probably saw the headlines. I've been very vocal about it. My partner is transgender. So obviously, this is a big thing with me. But in regards to like affordability for college students in the state of California, what are you seeing like the impacts of these predatory student loans? And it comes down to, well, do I risk having my lights shut off or not having food on the table or not being able to pay my car payment to pay
Yeah.
back these student loans? Or do I risk having if you don't pay that student loan, they're threatening to come and seize your assets or seize, your income or, threatening a number of other things. So what are you seeing in regards to like financial aid in students and then also like the affordability around like college? And I know this is a question that's not really talked about a lot, but it's something that I really want to hit on just for like a brief moment, and then we'll kind of wrap up. And yeah, I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on this, what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge issue, right? And honestly, it's having a tremendous impact on students and their decisions as to whether or not they're going to attend college and whether or not like they're going to pursue their educational dreams.
Hmm.
Because the reality is as we continue to either do away with financial aid or not raise the amount, that it is pushing more and more students to rely heavily on predatory student loans. And that has a negative impact on society overall. We need good doctors and good nurses and engineers and attorneys and teachers entering into the workforce. And if people don't feel like that dream's possible, then that becomes a problem because who is going
Hmm.
to take on those jobs? And so I do a lot of work in the education space. I chair the Senate Education Committee. I also chair the Budget Subcommittee on Education. And so a lot of what we've had to do is be creative about how we backfill a lot of that funding. I'm working on a bond initiative this year to replace much of the research funding that's been rescinded by the federal government, and have also worked on a number of efforts even before I was in the legislature to raise the Pell Grant, to raise what we call the Cal Grant here in the state of California, because we know as costs continue to rise for everyday consumers, whether it's housing costs, transportation costs, food costs, those costs are also rising for students. And if I'm a
Hmm.
student and I'm faced with those cost pressures, I have a family, I have dependents, the first thing that I'm going to cut off, if it's a choice between whether or not I can pay for food for my kids or for rent, or I have to pay tuition, I'm going to cut off tuition. And that is not a healthy society. If we want more people and more individuals to go to college and to make that decision, we have to make it a good economic one for them as well. So
Hmm.
I do think that this overall is a troubling trend by the Trump administration because they frankly do not want an educated electorate. They do not want people to understand the history of the prison industrial complex and how it's ultimately connected to for-profit detention centers. That's not a good thing for Trump or his donors. And so trying to keep that kind of education and access to it limited is something that benefits them. And I think that that is largely what they are trying to do. They are trying to disincentivize people from going to college and from getting educated about the systems at play.
Well, you know what he said? I love the poorly educated. He made it very clear.
Yeah.
And you're right. And he wants to continue in this capitalistic hellscape, for lack of a better term and lack of better words. But it really is. And it's like this trickle down economic, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and then they die because they don't have access to that healthcare. They don't have access to housing. They don't have access to food. I think my mom sent me an article that 3.4 million people have been removed off of food stamps. She is one of those people as a disabled woman, as somebody who's going through stage 3C cervical cancer. We just got a clear bill of health for her. So, yay. That's
Oh,
great.
wonderful.
But without her Medicaid expansion, and she had COVID a couple years ago, Without that, she would have had over $100,000 hospital bill that she, as a disabled woman, didn't get her SSI until literally last year. And we fought for
Wow.
12 years to get that. That's the system working exactly how it was designed. And we need people like you that are not afraid, that have a backbone, and will continue to fight back. So, I think I speak for a lot of us. Thank you for the work that you do, but also I know you do it because it also impacts you. It will make your life better. It will make your family's life better. It will make everybody around you's life better. So, to anybody out there who's listening, how can they follow you on social media and uplift the work that you are doing?
Yeah, well, all of my social media online is Sasha Renee Perez. So if you look me up, it's Renee with three E's, Renee. And that is my full name. It is my real name. And you can find me there. Follow me on Instagram. My official accounts are Senator SRP. Those accounts are run by staff. If you reach out to them, just like as an FYI. I like to make sure that we have something that's documenting everything that I do. If I posted everything that I did on my personal account, I'd probably post like 9 times a day. So, but always happy to answer questions and talk with anybody that's interested in the work, wants to know about our policy work, or just interested in running for office in general. I think right now it's such a critical time to just get really good people to run for office who genuinely care about the issues and really want to do good policy making because that's what we need more of.
Absolutely. All right, Senator, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk with me today. I greatly appreciate you. And I look forward to seeing, and we can obviously have a lot more conversations and continue the collaboration, to continue, amplifying the work that you are doing. Because I think it's, like you said, I think it's so critical to get these voices out there and get these stories heard and understand how complex these issues really are that are affecting our communities, not only personally, but as a whole, right? So, again, thank you so much for taking the time. Please take care of yourself and don't be a stranger. I'm so excited to continue collaborating with you. And this has been a really eye opening and uplifting conversation. I greatly appreciate you.
Yeah, of course. Oh my goodness. And thank you for having me too. It's really special to get to meet and connect. So and happy to continue working together.
All right. Please take care of yourself, okay?
Okay, yeah, I will talk with you soon.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.